Hello, I'm Hannah Kaplan, and this is the WCS Wild Audio Podcast, where you'll find reported audio stories covering the latest news and newsmakers from the Wildlife Conservation Society's Global Conservation Program, Zoos and Aquarium, and their many partners. We've got a great show today, so let's get to it. When the Cat Specialist Group of the International Union for Conservation of Nature, or IUCN, met in San Diego in 2019, they were keen to identify fresh insights in jaguar conservation. Delayed due to COVID, the effort got back on track in 2023. This past winter, its findings were published. It seemed like a good moment to check in with some of WCS's leading jaguar conservationists to see how Latin America's biggest cat is faring. Nat Moss has this report.
For centuries, jaguars roamed the Americas, from the present-day southwestern United States to northern Argentina. But in the past half-century, these big cats have lost roughly half their natural range.
Since jaguars are big carnivores, that means they can walk up mountains and cross rivers. So they're really good dispersing. They're really good moving around. And the barriers, at least the natural barriers, aren't a big deal. But the human barriers are. And when I say human barriers, I mean a town between two forest patches, a highway, and just endless fields of soy or livestock where they'll be shot if they cross them.
Esteban Payan is the big cats lead for WCS in Latin America. Today, he says, one of the greatest threats to jaguars is habitat loss.
Habitat loss implies deforestation, implies a loss of the quality of that habitat, what we're talking about with selective logging or selective hunting of their prey. And that's pushed in a great deal by the agriculture sector for soy, for oil palm, and livestock. So much of these frontiers are deforesting to change those land uses. That's the worst because of the scale and of the destruction.
Climate change is also contributing to that loss, as drought-induced fires devour acre after acre in the Amazon.
There's something we call the new threats to jaguars, and these are human-made fires, because fires have an intense level of destruction, move really fast, and the scale of fires is huge. So the destruction is so intense and so large, that's really, really worrying.
And it's not just forest fires, but savanna fires as well, that conservationists have seen in the Amazon in the last 3 or 4 years.
Obviously, that has an impact on habitat, not just the existence of the habitat, but also the quality of the habitat.
That's WCS Bolivia-based senior conservationist Rob Wallace. 50 years ago, he says, the greatest threat to jaguars was not fire or deforestation. It was the hunting of jaguars for their skins, for clothing and rugs. That led the parties to the Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species, or CITES, to place the jaguar on its Appendix 1, banning all international trade.
Jaguars were placed on Appendix 1 many years ago when the illegal trafficking of jaguar skins and other spotted cat skins in South America and elsewhere was a major threat to basically all wild felines. It was clear that between roughly the 1930s and the 1980s, that was a huge threat to jaguar populations.
Rob says that once jaguars were protected by CITES, Bolivia spent a lot of time and effort declaring a number of large protected areas. And in many of those places, jaguar populations began to come back as conservationists with WCS and other organizations worked with governments of jaguar range countries to stabilize and slowly expand jaguar populations.
We were using the approach of landscape scale conservation and crucially supporting our local partners. So the protected area authorities, both national and subnational, particularly indigenous organizations and the communities that they represent. When I talk about landscape conservation, that's what I'm talking about. That kind of real long-term muddy boots, whatever, nuts and bolts, whatever you want to call it, that's what conservation is about.
But around 2014, says WCS coordinator of counter wildlife trafficking, Mariana de Silva, conservationists saw that an old familiar threat had reemerged while they'd been focused on things like habitat loss and conflict over the predation of livestock.
Jaguar trade was not in the picture at all. Since the 80s, it decreased a lot. It was not important anymore. But yes, since 2014, in Bolivia, a lot of packages with many jaguar teeth, like hundreds of jaguar teeth, were detected here on their way to Asia, particularly China. So that rang the alarms to start paying attention again. And WCS started to gather that official data to try to understand the scale. And we now know that it is a big threat to jaguars. We found out more than 200 jaguars were included in the teeth trade.
This was all happening, she says, despite the fact that jaguars remained on CITES Appendix 1, which bans all trade. According to Mariana, more than 95% of the trade in jaguar teeth is tied to sales in China, perhaps an inevitable outcome of globalization.
Everybody is more connected now. There are more direct flights from Latin America to Asia. It's easier to exchange any type of goods from one part of the world to another. Now you have online platforms that allow people from one side of the world to just look into things from the other side and just request, and then you buy that and you will get them in your house in a couple of weeks or even sooner.
Yet while the trade in Jaguar parts had clearly become a major problem, it was unclear that this alone accounted for a drop-off in the growth of Jaguar numbers that conservationists in Bolivia were beginning to see. What if another factor was playing a bigger role than they'd thought? Rob Wallace explains.
Just as we need to understand jaguar behavior and ecology better in order to make informed decisions, we also need to understand their prey. And so one of their most important prey species across Latin America is the white-lipped peccary.
Rob notes that around the same time that the illegal jaguar trade was ramping up again in Bolivia, a palm species whose fruit peccaries thrive on failed to produce fruit 2 years in a row in the Madidi landscape of Bolivia.
White-lipped peccaries are a sort of pig-like animal that live in very large herds and have huge impact on the ecology of the forest. They're keystone species, the very definition. And it turns out that their populations fluctuate. We still don't understand exactly how they fluctuate. We don't know if they die off or they migrate. But it looks like in the case of Madidi, they left. And because they left, that's a huge portion of the jaguar prey base that left, right? And so that has implications.
For Esteban, those implications relate to the idea of ecological integrity.
Those animals that are big and carnivorous means that they need a lot of prey, and that prey will only exist if that forest is in a good state. And that forest will only exist, of course, if it's not chopped down, it's not eroded by humans. So jaguars are something of an indicator species, something we call an umbrella species or a focal species, meaning if we have jaguars there, because they're big and a carnivore, the state of that natural habitat is well conserved.
Jaguars in particular occur at low densities and require a lot of space. Not surprisingly, their individual ranges are not limited to the borders of any one country. Most of the strongholds where jaguar populations have the best chance of surviving are multi-country geographies, particularly in the area of the Amazon, says Esteban.
The stronghold for jaguars nowadays is the Amazon basin, the Amazon jungle, the Amazon forest. And what we try to do is work at a landscape level for jaguars, but also try to maintain connectivity from that core in the Amazon to the other areas that can be connected through corridors.
The importance of habitat connectivity to the persistence of jaguars is one of several topics that receive a focus in the IUCN Cat Specialist Group report published this winter. You can find a link to that in our show notes. Despite the many challenges facing jaguars, Esteban, for one, is hopeful.
I think we still have time to save the jaguar as a whole with most of its range. We still have big numbers in areas like the Amazon or the Chaco. I'd say the call today is more to working together from international specialist groups like the Cat Specialist Group that produced this special jaguar volume to working with governments, working among NGOs.
And indeed today, WCS is part of the steering committee of the Jaguar 2030 initiative that also includes Panthera, WWF, the United Nations, and the World Bank, among others.
This common front moves and is taken very seriously by governments. The siloed approach of every NGO doing its thing hasn't worked, and Jaguars don't recognize boundaries among countries. They don't recognize study sites among NGOs or other universities. So we really need to work together. It is a call to work together, and especially given the more than 7 million square kilometers where they inhabit, it's just a huge task.
Mariana points to a recent gathering of jaguar range countries in Brazil.
Last year, there was a meeting in Brazil to discuss coordinated strategies among the countries to conserve jaguars and use the same tools and exchange information, data, efforts, etc., to act together. So I think that's another good example of how governments are cooperating and also increasing their interest to conserve key species like jaguars.
And not a moment too soon, says Esteban.
There's been talk about this for ages on all aspects of conservation. But this is it. I mean, the clock is ticking, and we can't be talking about this in 15 years, 20 years down the line, because it's going to be too late.
Mariana is convinced that the challenge can be met.
I'm very hopeful about the future of jaguars because I've seen how many people from very different backgrounds, different nations are together working for the jaguar as an ambassador of nature. So I think jaguar has that ability to make people fall in love with him and make people fall in love with nature and get people to act.
For WCS Wild Audio, this is Nat Moss.
Today's episode was produced and reported by Nat Moss, with help from Hannah Kaplan and Dan Rosen. The WCS Wild Audio podcast is a production of the Wildlife Conservation Society. Please join us next week for a new episode, and don't forget to rate or review the show wherever you get your podcast.